Shit. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, the tires screeching in protest. A deafening horn blasted through the rain-soaked air, nearly bursting my eardrums as blinding white headlights lit up the car's interior. In that split second, my life flashed before my eyes. Then, the uneven bump of the grassy roadside jolted me around in my seat. The massive 18-wheeler that had drifted into my lane missed by less than a foot, roaring past in a blur at what had to be over 70 miles an hour. After a breathless pause, I fumbled to lower the driver's window, shoving my head out into the downpour. "Asshole!" I yelled at the rapidly disappearing logging truck, fully aware that the driver wouldn't hear me. Seconds later, an indignant voice crackled from the speakers of my rented Chrysler 300. "Excuse me?" Oh, right. I'd been in the middle of a phone call. Still shaken, I settled back into the seat. "Not you, Aaron," I apologized. "If you didn't hear the chaos, I just about became roadkill thanks to some idiot in a Peterbilt drifting into my lane." There was a moment of silence. Then Aaron, my agent, let out a dry snort. "Well, isn't that something? You've got to love the morons on the road these days." Her tone softened. "I'm just relieved you're okay, Al. I don't feel like losing my best client and close friend all at once." I chuckled, the tension beginning to ebb. "It's good to know you care." After taking a moment to shake off the lingering nerves, I pulled the car back onto the road and continued my journey. It was the winter of 2022, and I was driving from my home in Gold Beach, Oregon, to a book signing in Seattle. My debut novel had just hit the New York Times bestseller list, and I was kicking off my book signing tour across the country. Since my real name would give away too much, I've changed a few details, including names. Aaron, my literary agent, had suggested I fly out of North Bend, but flying wasn't an option for me. Ever since the 9/11 attacks, planes had become a source of crippling anxiety. Knowing I hadn't yet replaced my beat-up old car, she arranged a rental for me. So instead of a quick flight, I was facing a nearly 7.5-hour drive north. If that accident hadn't shut down I-5, I wouldn't be dealing with these lunatics. I muttered to myself. "Well, you're the one who insisted on driving, Al." Aaron's voice teased over the speakers. "Any idea where you are?" I glanced at the glitchy GPS for what felt like the 100th time. The screen flickered as the antenna struggled to lock onto a satellite signal. "No clue. This navigation system's being a piece of junk," I grumbled. "So much for Enterprise renting out decent cars." Just then, I caught a glimpse of a gas station sign up ahead, its symbol flashing by like a small miracle. Thank God for that. "Hey, there's a gas station coming up. I need to fill up anyway. I'll stop, get directions, and call you once I'm back on the road, okay?" Aaron sighed. "Fine, just don't take too long. The publisher won't be thrilled if you're late to your very first book signing tomorrow." "I'll make it quick," I promised, pressing the red disconnect button on the steering wheel. Finally, silence. Aaron had been my rock, securing my contract and landing me a sizable advance, but sometimes she could be exhausting. I stared ahead at the rain-slicked road, soaking in the peaceful sound of raindrops tapping the windshield, the wipers swishing, and the tires hissing on wet pavement. For a few minutes, all I saw was the dense wall of trees crowding in on both sides of the road, as though they were straining to catch a glimpse of the cars passing by. Then, as if on cue, the bright lights of the gas station flickered into view on the right, standing out like a beacon. The place looked like it had been around for ages, maybe since the 1950s, if not earlier. I raised my eyebrows in surprise as I noticed the station's logo, an old-fashioned Sinclair sign, lazily spinning on its pole, the faded green brontosaurus and worn-out red letters standing as a relic of a company I thought had disappeared back in March. Guess nobody told the owner that. I pulled into the station, rolling over a small black wire that triggered the classic ding of a bell somewhere out of sight. I parked by the green pump, turned off the engine, and sank back into the leather seat, listening to the rhythmic tick of the engine cooling. With my eyes closed, I could hear nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the rain tapping against the metal awning overhead. When I opened my eyes, The rain had slowed, and I glanced at the analog clock on the dash, its faint glow showing 7:30 p.m. 10 minutes had slipped by. I sighed in frustration. "Come on, man," I muttered, giving the horn a quick tap. The sudden blare cut through the stillness like shattering glass, but no one appeared. "Damn it," I whispered, unbuckling my seatbelt and kicking the door open with my foot. A gust of freezing wind hit me, forcing me to flip up the collar of my coat. I stepped out onto the cracked concrete, listening to the wind whistle through the trees, the occasional cricket chirp, and an owl hooting somewhere in the dark woods. I glanced toward the open garage bays, lit by faded yellow incandescent bulbs. Inside, I could make out an old 1950s Cadillac and a 1970s International Scout, both sitting on lifts, but no mechanic in sight. Leaning back into the car, I laid on the horn a bit longer this time. The sound echoed off the station and the surrounding trees, sending a shiver through me for reasons I couldn't explain. It felt almost wrong to disturb the silence in this place. I shook off the thought. Where had that come from? After waiting another minute, without a sign of life, I started to wonder if the station was closed. That was a worrying thought. I hadn't seen a single trace of civilization, aside from that reckless logging truck, for over 2 hours. I had no clue how far the next gas station might be, and while the Chrysler was decent on fuel, I didn't want to risk running out on a quarter tank. Determined to get answers, I slammed the driver's door shut with a solid thunk and walked toward the open garage bays, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the concrete. I peered around, noticing the oil stains on the ground and the scattered tools and bottles haphazardly tossed onto a workbench. Still, no one was around. Great, I thought, glancing up just as the moon began to peek out from behind the clouds. As I turned to head toward what I assumed was the office or convenience store, the door suddenly flew open and a figure stepped out, startling me so badly I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Gah!" I yelped involuntarily, which earned a good-natured laugh from the man. "Sorry, sir. Didn't mean to scare you or leave you waiting so long," he said, still chuckling. I took a moment to catch my breath and let out a shaky laugh of my own, finally getting a good look at him. He seemed to be in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a green Sinclair jumpsuit, complete with the iconic dinosaur logo on a patch over his chest. The other patch displayed his name, Harold. His remaining hair was slicked back, and he flashed a friendly smile, revealing surprisingly bright white teeth. I raised a hand, waving it off with a relieved grin. "No worries, man. For a second I thought this place was permanently shut down or something." My voice steadied as I spoke. Harold wiped his brow in a playful gesture. "Nope. Just little ol' me holding down the fort on the night shift." I snorted, appreciating his sense of humor. "You need gas?" he asked, glancing over at my car. I nodded. "Yeah, fill her up with regular, please." He nodded back and walked toward the pump as I jogged around to hit the button that released the gas cap. Harold let out a low whistle as he grabbed the pump from its cradle. "Nice ride." "Looks expensive," he commented, giving the Chrysler a once-over. I shrugged. "It's a Chrysler 300S. Pretty nice, yeah. But it's not mine." Harold raised an eyebrow as he inserted the nozzle and started the gas flow. "It's a rental," I added quickly, realizing how that could have sounded. His expression relaxed and he chuckled. "Ah, that makes sense. We don't usually see cars that new or fancy around here." I nodded toward the open bays. "Looks like people around here have good taste, though." "That's a 55 Coupe de Ville back there, right?" Harold grinned, clearly impressed. "You know your cars." "Yeah, that's the one. Gorgeous, isn't it?" "I love 'em," I admitted, glancing at the gas pump as it ticked steadily toward full. He glanced back at me with curiosity. "So, are you an auto collector or maybe a race car driver?" he asked, half serious. I shook my head with a smile. "No, nothing that exciting. I'm just a writer." His eyes lit up under the fluorescent lights, seeming to twinkle with genuine interest. "A writer? Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd get a real-life writer at my station," he said with a grin. I nodded, feeling a familiar wave of discomfort. I hadn't quite gotten used to the reactions people had when they learned what I did for a living. "What kind of books do you write?" He pressed on, clearly intrigued. "Horror, mostly," I admitted, and his grin grew wider. "Horror? That's my favorite genre. I love everything from the old classics to Stephen King," he exclaimed. His expression became thoughtful. "How many books have you written?" I held up a single finger. "Just one so far. I'm actually on my way to a book signing for it right now." He nodded in approval, glancing at the pump as the numbers climbed. Then, out of the blue, he asked, "So, have you ever seen anything truly scary?" I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean by that?" Still watching the pump, he continued, "A lot of horror writers talk about how they've had their own frightening experience, whether it's a real scare or something supernatural. They say it helps them create truly terrifying stories." He looked back at me with a grin that suddenly seemed too wide for comfort, though I blinked and realized it was just a normal smile, albeit a bit odd. Must be the lights playing tricks on me. "I was just curious if you've ever had a scary experience that inspired your writing," he clarified. For a moment, we stood there in silence, broken only by the distant screech of an owl in the dark woods. I shrugged. "Honestly? Number. I hate to disappoint you, but I've never had anything like that happen to me." His face showed surprise. "Really?" "Really," I replied, deciding to be open about it. As much as I love horror, writing it, reading it, watching it, I stopped being scared of it a long time ago. His surprise deepened. "No kidding?" "Yeah, it's kinda sad, honestly. I used to love getting spooked by a good book or movie, but as I got older, that fear just faded away. Now when I write, I focus on what I know will scare other people, like with my first book. But I don't feel that fear anymore when I write." I felt a strange sense of relief admitting that. I'd lied about it during interviews, telling magazines that my own work still scared me. But in truth, I hadn't been scared by horror in years. It felt good to finally be honest, even with a stranger I'd probably never see again. When I looked up, I found Harold staring at me with an intense, unsettling gaze. His green eyes seemed to glow under the lights, and his smile had vanished completely. I took a small step back, unnerved by the sudden change in his expression. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the strange look disappeared, replaced by the familiar smile. "Well, I'm sure if you keep searching, you'll find that feeling again," he said, his tone full of sympathy. I nodded and glanced out at the darkened forest. "I hope so," I replied honestly, as the pump clicked off with a final beep. "Ah, all done," Harold said cheerfully, removing the nozzle and returning it to the cradle. He checked the meter. "That'll be $23.17. I blinked in surprise. Under $24 for nearly 3/4 of a tank? I hadn't seen gas prices this low since I was a teenager, but I wasn't about to complain. I pulled out my wallet and handed him my credit card. "Do you take credit?" Harold happily plucked the card from my hand. "Of course." "But the card reader's back inside the building," he explained, gesturing toward the door he'd come from earlier. "Would you mind if I take it inside to run?" I shook my head. "Go ahead." He turned and strode toward the building. "I'll be back with your receipt before you can say Bob's your uncle," he called over his shoulder, making me chuckle. As he disappeared into the station, something struck me. I hadn't seen Harold's back until just now. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The back of his jumpsuit was as stained green as the front, with a red oil rag sticking out of his back pocket. Yet, my attention was caught by something else, a large tear in the fabric just below the sizable logo patch on his back, almost as though he'd been slashed. Beneath the jumpsuit, I could make out an equally grimy white shirt. Hey," I called to him. He stopped and turned back to me, still wearing a smile. "Yes?" he asked. I pointed to my own back. "Your jumpsuit has a pretty big tear in the back. Just wanted to let you know in case you hadn't noticed." For a moment, his face took on the same odd expression as before, but then he waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I know. Haven't had time to fix it yet," he replied with a grin. Raising a finger, he opened the door, which made a small bell hanging from the handle jingle, and stepped inside. Once again, I was left alone, the sudden quiet punctuated only by the low buzzing of the overhead lights, which almost seemed to ring in my ears. Not wanting to appear rude by sitting in the car, I decided to stroll to the front and leaned against the hood, gazing into the night. My eyes wandered absent-mindedly into the darkness as I waited for Harold to come back. That's when I finally glanced at the large sign in front of me. It was the one displaying the gas prices, which I hadn't noticed earlier since I came from the opposite direction and got distracted by the conversation. The sign had clearly seen better days, its internal light flickering erratically as if it would burn out at any moment. You could even hear its irregular buzzing in the otherwise quiet night. But that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was the prices on the sign that made me do a double take. "There's no way," I whispered to myself. I scanned the numbers, but my eyes kept returning to the top two lines. 88 cents a gallon for regular gas? A small wave of confusion washed over me. No matter how remote this station was, there was no way gas would be that cheap. On top of that, the sign listed both unleaded and leaded gasoline, something that had been banned since at least the mid-90s. As I tried to make sense of it, another realization hit me. The forest around the station had gone completely silent, and not the usual kind of silence. The crickets, the owl, and the rustling I'd assumed were deer or elk moving in the trees. Everything had stopped. Even the wind seemed to have died. It was an almost unnatural stillness, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. The eerie silence sent a shiver down my spine. The only sound remaining was the increasingly maddening buzz of the overhead lights, droning like the low growl of a creature. I realized my muscles had all tensed, though I couldn't explain why. Sure, the silence was unsettling, but I kept telling myself there was nothing to be afraid of. Despite repeating that, I couldn't shake the growing unease creeping through me. "Okay, screw this," I muttered under my breath, even the sound of my own voice echoing back at me in a way that felt off. I pushed myself off the hood and started toward the door Harold had disappeared through. Glancing at my watch, I saw that another 15 minutes had passed since he went inside. Where the hell is he? With a sigh, equal parts frustration and an attempt to relieve the strange tension building inside me, I reached the door and grabbed the handle. The metal felt shockingly cold against my skin as I twisted it, the bell jingling loudly as I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me, causing the bell to chime once more, though now muted in the enclosed space. I glanced around. Aside from an old Coca-Cola machine in one corner, there weren't any snacks or drinks inside. The small room was mostly taken up by 2 or 3 narrow aisles filled with old-style cans of motor oil and various automotive knickknacks, all bearing a dinosaur logo. I took a breath, but quickly coughed. It was musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in ages. Looking straight ahead, I saw the counter where Harold probably worked. An old-fashioned cash register sat atop it, and behind the counter, an open door marked "Employees Only" led to a long, tiled hallway that stretched into the distance before curving out of sight. I stared at the register for a moment. I hadn't seen one of those since I was a kid in the 90s, and a brief wave of nostalgia washed over me, tugging at my heart despite the unease lingering in the air. But just as quickly, that small wave of nostalgia was swept away by the unsettling feeling that was slowly closing in on me, like a cloud of dust settling over everything. This whole place, this entire situation, just felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on why, but the sensation was enough to make my arms and legs tingle, as if bugs were crawling under my skin. After a moment of hesitation, I opened my mouth. Hey, Harold," I called out, my voice oddly muted, much like the sound of the bell. I waited. Nothing. "Harold, are you back there?" I called again, louder this time. Still no response. The eerie buzzing of the fluorescent lights was getting louder, adding to my growing anxiety. I leaned forward and craned my neck to look down the hallway. At the far end, just around the corner, I could barely make out a bright blue restroom sign. I made a quick decision and called out once more. "Look, Harold, if you can hear me, I'm coming over the counter to use the restroom, okay? I can't wait until the next town." It was a lie. I didn't need to go at all. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything in the last few hours. But I didn't want to take any chances in case Harold came back around the corner. Even in my uneasy state, I didn't want to irritate him. Taking a deep breath, I vaulted over the counter and stepped into the corridor. Unlike the main room, the hallway was lit by several old incandescent bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting a dim glow that made everything look darker than it already was. I hesitated before heading down, making sure my footsteps didn't echo too loudly. The corridor felt like it stretched on forever, but eventually, I reached the corner. Wanting to keep up the charade, I grabbed the bathroom doorknob and opened it. I took one look inside and immediately shut it, gagging slightly. The bathroom was absolutely revolting, like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. Turning back to the hallway, I noticed a brighter light further down. I paused for a second, debating whether to go on, but ultimately continued. All I wanted was to get out of this place. As I walked, I passed an open door that led to the garage bays, catching a glimpse of the outside through them. The cold air wafting in from the open doors provided a brief, welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere. Pressing on, I finally reached another doorway and peered in. It was an office. 2 desks were set up, and I saw Harold's nameplate on the far one. My heart leapt with relief as I spotted my credit card, lying in the middle of the desk, its bright blue contrasting against the dark wood and scattered papers. Exhaling a sigh of relief, I quickly walked over and snatched it up. I decided then and there that I'd leave cash instead and get out as fast as possible. I had no idea where Harold had disappeared to, but everything inside me screamed to leave. I pulled out my wallet, ready to drop a 20 and a 10 on the desk when something on the wall caught my eye. It was a plaque, gleaming faintly in the low light. I squinted at it. The photograph was unmistakably Harold, looking just like I had seen him earlier, though much cleaner. Beneath the photo, in engraved letters on the faux gold plaque, were the words, "Employee of the Month, Harold Jankowski." For a brief second, I smiled, imagining how proud he must have been when he earned it. But then, my smile vanished as my eyes reached the date underneath. August 1976. I stared in disbelief, shaking my head, hoping the dim light was playing tricks on me. Surely when I looked again, it would say 2006 or even 1996. But no, it stayed the same. "What the hell?" I breathed, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. If Harold had been in his 40s or 50s back in 1976, there was no way he'd still look like this now, 40-something years later. By now he should have been well into his 80s if not his 90s, and certainly not still working at this rundown station. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered again, the feeling of dread coiling tighter around me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run out of this office, out of this gas station, and never look back. But I stopped in my tracks. Harold was there. Sitting in an old black swivel chair, his back turned to me. He was in the next room. The space was dimly lit by a single weak light bulb hanging directly above him, casting eerie shadows across the room. I couldn't make out what kind of room it was, but everything about it felt wrong, sending chills down my spine. For the first time in years, I felt real fear creeping in. Before I could say anything, Harold spoke. "Well, Mr. Damascus," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. I opened my mouth to respond. "Harold, look, I'm sorry for barging in here, I didn't mean—" He cut me off, his voice still cold. "Mr. Damascus, how do you feel?" I hesitated, confusion replacing the fear for a moment. Excuse me?" I stammered. "How do you feel?" he repeated, this time with a faint rise in inflection. Then slowly his voice began to take on a more sinister tone. "Do you feel afraid? Do you feel Fear? He let out a low chuckle, one that sounded disturbingly different from the happy one I'd heard earlier outside. For a moment, I couldn't find any words. Then he spoke again. It's all right. You don't need to answer. I can feel it. Another unsettling chuckle escaped him, sending shivers racing up my spine. And honestly, Mr. Damascus, I'm glad, he said, standing up but still not turning around. Because you all taste so much better when you're afraid. A response finally escaped my lips. What the fuck? It wasn't much, but apparently Harold found it amusing. He chuckled again, this time a darker, creepier sound that made my skin crawl. Then, as he turned to face me, I instinctively stepped back, slamming into his desk. His nameplate clattered to the floor. His smile remained, but now it was far too wide, twisted with an almost malicious glee. His eyes, which had been lively and green earlier, now looked glassy and vacant, almost like those of a ventriloquist's dummy. It was as if he wasn't truly alive anymore, but rather a puppet, something unnatural controlling him. He leaned slightly toward me, and I felt a sickening sense of dread settle in. I'll make it sporting, though, he said, his voice unnervingly calm. You have 20 seconds to run. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting around for anything I could use to defend myself. My gaze landed on a tire iron resting on his desk, and I grabbed it, ready to swing if he made a move. But then something even stranger happened. He collapsed. Harold simply fell forward, face first into the room, and lay there motionless. I stared down at him, stunned. His body looked wrong, deflated almost, like a beach ball with all the air let out. His jumpsuit, now sagging even more, revealed the tear in the back, this time much larger and more grotesque. His dirty white shirt underneath had also torn, exposing something far more horrifying. A gaping hole in his back. I could see his spine, stark white in the sickly yellow light. I gasped in horror, but before I could process what I was looking at, a voice, one that wasn't Harold's, filled the room. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, so low and menacing it felt like it shook my bones. The sound of it nearly made me piss myself, dripping with a sadistic glee. 20. My blood ran cold. 19. The countdown. 18. I looked toward the darkened room Harold had fallen from, and my heart stopped. Just beyond the reach of the dim light, I saw them. Two enormous, glowing green eyes. Their inhuman crescent moon shape burned with an otherworldly malice, the kind of glee that came from inflicting pain. A scream tore from my throat, something primal and full of terror. The countdown stopped, and the voice laughed, an awful, screeching sound like nails on a chalkboard. Then it resumed, now even more excited. 16, 15, 14. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran as fast as I could, the tire iron forgotten in my panic. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest, my breathing ragged and desperate. My footsteps echoed like gunfire as I bolted down the corridor, but no matter how far I ran, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. It made no sense. It should have only taken a few steps to reach the corner, but it felt like I was running for miles. Finally, I reached the corner, only to find myself right back at the entrance to the office. What the fuck? How could I be back here? Panic surged through me as the voice behind me hit 10. I turned and sprinted again, but this time, the hallway felt even longer. I reached out to grab the corner edge, desperate to escape, but my hand grasped the wooden frame of the office door. I was trapped. Tears streamed down my face as I ran again, my sobs echoing in the suffocating corridor. The voice continued its countdown, closer now, as if it was just behind me. 7, 6, 5. I crashed into the wall next to the office door, gasping in pain. My vision blurred from the tears, the blood dripping from where I'd slammed my head into the wall. 3, 2, 1. The voice lowered into a guttural growl, each word sending waves of terror through me. Ready or not, Mr. Damascus, here, come. It was as though the devil himself had spoken directly into my ear. I knew if I looked behind me, I would see it. The thing standing over Harold's deflated body, waiting for me to turn around. It wanted me to look, wanted me to see the horror that was about to claim me, but I refused. My body trembled with fear, tears mixing with the blood on my face. I could feel its presence behind me, feel its sadistic joy as it toyed with me. All the gruesome deaths I'd seen in movies or read about flashed through my mind, and I knew that whatever fate awaited me was far worse. But then, in the midst of my terror, a single thought sparked in my mind, just a tiny sliver of hope. Something I'd noticed earlier as I walked down the hall to the office. My heart pounded as adrenaline surged through me. This might be my only chance, my only shot at survival. I might die trying, but I had to do it. I had to try. I heard the floor rattle behind me, followed by the unmistakable sensation of hot, putrid breath hitting the back of my neck. For the briefest of moments, I froze, paralyzed by sheer terror. Then, with a strangled cry, I forced my body into action. A furious bellow echoed from behind, followed by that unnerving laugh. It knew I was running, but it didn't care. It was confident. It had power over this place, over the endless corridor that kept pulling me back. But it didn't know I'd found its weak spot. That single thought kept replaying in my mind as I ran, the scream tearing from my throat. The corridor seemed impossibly long, but as I neared the middle, I saw it. The door to the garage, barely visible behind a stack of oil cans. I let out a cry of determination this time, and behind me, the creature's laughter turned into a deafening roar of rage. It knew what I was trying to do. I felt it charging down the hallway, gaining on me. Something sharp sliced across my back, and I gritted my teeth against the pain, pushing myself to move faster. I leaped for the doorway and tumbled through, landing in a puddle of thick, sticky oil beneath an ancient, rusting Cadillac. Without missing a beat, I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the open bay doors. The creature's bellow grew louder behind me, but I didn't look back. I burst out into the night, the familiar sounds of the forest rushing back into my ears. I sprinted to my car, barely pausing as I flung myself over the hood and ripped open the driver's side door. Throwing myself into the seat, I jabbed at the start button, a wave of panic washing over me. Please don't stall. Please don't stall. But to my utter relief, the engine roared to life on the first try. Grabbing the gear shift, I jammed it into drive and glanced up for a split second. That's when I saw it. The entire gas station had gone dark. The lights inside, the overheads, everything. It was just an empty silhouette now. Except for the eyes. Those enormous, glowing green eyes, glaring at me from within the garage bays, seething with rage and hatred. I couldn't tear my gaze away fast enough. Screaming, I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. I shot out from under the awning and back onto the road, speeding away as fast as I could. I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I knew. I'd see those eyes staring back one final time, and I couldn't bear it. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The headlights stretched out in front of me as I tore down the road, desperate to leave that nightmare far behind. I didn't let up on the gas pedal the entire way, taking corners recklessly, almost skidding off the road more than once. I didn't slow down until the warm glow of the next town's lights came into view. I didn't even know the name of the town. It didn't matter. Relief washed over me, and I felt tears streaming down my face, this time not out of fear, but from sheer gratitude that I'd made it out alive. I drove straight to the police station. I knew I couldn't tell them the truth. No one would believe me. They'd think I was high or out of my mind. So I told them I'd been attacked by a crazed man at an old gas station, keeping the details vague. As I stumbled inside, shaking and out of breath, the officers at the desk quickly came to my aid, calming me down as I gave my statement. When I showed them the deep slashes across my back, their expressions shifted from concern to something darker, more serious. One of the officers went into the back while a paramedic, who had just arrived, started tending to my wounds. A few moments later, the officer returned with the sergeant on duty, a grizzled man in his 60s. He looked me over, then spoke gently. "Son, could you tell me again what happened to you?" I repeated my story, struggling to keep my voice steady. When I finished, the sergeant shook his head slowly, his face lined with concern. "Son, it couldn't have happened at the Sinclair station you're talking about," he said, his voice soft but firm. I blinked, confused. Why not?" I stammered, feeling my stomach twist into knots. "Because," he said quietly, "that station closed down in 1979 after a fire gutted the place, killed everyone inside." His words hung in the air like a cold weight, and I felt my heart drop. My mind raced, trying to reconcile what I'd just been through with what he was telling me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. There was no explanation. All I knew was I had survived something that shouldn't have been possible, and whatever it was that had chased me, whatever those eyes belonged to, was still out there. It's been almost 6 months since that night. I never made it to my book signing, which earned me a furious phone call from Erin. Her anger faded quickly when I told her I'd been attacked. I explained that it happened while helping someone broken down on the side of the road, not wanting to repeat the strange conversation I'd had with the police. They assured me they'd do their best to find whoever was responsible, but I knew they never would. Not after they showed me that old newspaper article. The yellowed page featured the burned-out remains of the gas station I'd been to, along with a photograph of a smiling man I recognized all too well. Despite everything, I'm still a horror writer. That night didn't stop me from doing what I love. In fact, my second novel is set to release later this year. But now, when I sit down to write a truly frightening scene, the chills that crawl up my spine feel all too real. Because I've seen true horror, felt it in my bones, and I know it exists out there, lurking in the forgotten corners of the world. I can only hope I never stumble upon it again. I'm sharing this story here not just to finally tell the truth about what I experienced, but as a warning. To anyone who will listen, if you ever find yourself driving through the Pacific Northwest, down a lonely, desolate 2-lane road in the middle of nowhere, and you happen to come across an old gas station, one with a faded green Brontosaurus logo spinning in the night, do yourself a favor. Don't stop. Keep your foot firmly on the gas and drive as far away as you can. Because next time, you might not be as lucky as I was.